I'm so thrilled to welcome 4 fantastic authors to our store. Lee Bardugo, author of the Grisha trilogy, here for Road and Rising. Ava Delara, here for Love Letters to the Dead. Jennifer Mathieu, here for The Truth About Alice. And Emmy Laybourne, here for the Monument 14 trilogy. So thrilled to welcome them all to our store, and so thrilled to have such a fantastic turnout. So thank you all for coming out on a Wednesday night to celebrate these 4 great authors. So first, we'd just love it if you could tell us a little bit about the books that you're here for. Would be great.
Sure. Why don't I start? I'm Emmy Laybourne. I'm going to talk to you about Monument 14, the first book in the trilogy. It's about 14 kids from Monument, Colorado, who get trapped in a superstore while civilization collapses outside the gates. And the kids don't want to go out because a series of escalating environmental catastrophes has wound up with the leak of a chemical weapons warfare compound from NORAD, which is nearby. This compound divides the population based on blood type, turning some people into paranoid freaks who hide away. Some people blister up and die. Some people turn into blood-lusting murderers. And the last blood type is made infertile and sterile, which is terrible, of course, but otherwise they're fine. So they're just left in the middle of this chaotic, disturbing landscape while everyone around them is dying and killing each other, and they're feeling great.
So it's a rom-com, right?
It's a beach read, you know, slight, like frothy.
I mean, that's what I read on the beach.
It is a dark world that I've created for my kids, but there are 14 of them, ranging in age from 5 to 18. And what happens is that the kids have to learn how to get along, how to take care of each other. And they vie for power within the group. There's romances between the teenagers. But in the end, really what the book is about finding the light within in the midst of a dark place. And I find that teenagers and adults who read my books can relate to that. Although, of course, we don't have horrible chemical weapons dividing our population and making us kill each other, for which I'm glad. So that's Monument 14, and it sets off, you know, the story of how these kids survive, how and if they make it to safety in the second and third books.
So hello everybody, it's so nice to see you all here. I'm Jennifer Mathieu, and this is my debut, The Truth About Alice. And it's set in a small, fictional Texas town, Healy, Texas. And it's told in alternating points of view by several 11th graders from Healy High School. And they are telling the reader the story of something that happened this summer before their junior year, when one of their classmates, Alice Franklin, allegedly slept with 2 boys in the same night at a party. And then shortly after that, she's linked to the death of one of those boys, Brandon Fitzsimmons, who was sort of the star quarterback, you know, the small town hero. And so kind of quickly, Alice goes from being, you know, a fairly popular, well-liked girl in this little town to being labeled a slut, being labeled a killer, and she's really ostracized by both her classmates and adults. And as the 11th graders sort of tell what they know, the reader is able to sort of put the puzzle pieces together, and then Alice has her say at the very end. And really, in the end, the reader is the only one who really knows the truth about what really happened the summer before 11th grade in Healy, Texas. So that's the truth about Alice.
So Love Letters to the Dead begins with Laurel starting high school when she gets an assignment in her English class to write a letter to a dead person. She chooses Kurt Cobain because her sister May loved him and he died young like May did, so she thinks he might understand. Only when it comes time to turn in the assignment, Laurel doesn't. She keeps writing to Kurt and to others like Judy Garland, Amy Winehouse, Janis Joplin, and River Phoenix. She connects to all of the people she writes to for different reasons, but as she learns more about their lives and work, she discovers they all have lessons to teach. In her letter, she talks about her splintering family, about new friendships, about falling in love for the first time, and about trying to grieve for her sister, May. And eventually, through the letter, she's able to come to terms with the secrets that she'd been holding on to around May's death as she finds her own voice and sense of self.
Hi, I'm Lee Bardugo. I wrote the Grisha trilogy. Shadow and Bone is the first book, Siege and Storm is the second book, and the third book that just came out is Ruin and Rising. So if you start the series, you can finish it without finishing it. Just saying. They are fantasy books set in a world inspired by Tsarist Russia. They tell the story of a country called Ravka that has been torn into by a swath of impenetrable darkness called the Shadow Fold. And in order for them to trade with the outside world, they send soldiers through. And into the fold goes Alina Starkov, who has spent her whole life being unwanted and unnoticed until her regiment is attacked. And she reveals the power that puts her on a collision course with the most powerful forces in the kingdom, including their leader, the Darkling. So that's where it all starts in Shadow and Bone. Siege and Storm introduces my Han Solo / Lando Calrissian character, Stormhound, and a pair of assassin twins, and a variety of other things, and Ruin and Rising is where all secrets are revealed.
I have to say, as someone who just finished reading Ruin and Rising, it's an apt title because it literally ruined me while I was reading it. So
tears, give me a
I signed up for that.
So I was wondering if the four of you could maybe talk a little bit about your path to publishing, how you ended up from wanting to write a book to here in our bookstore, which is maybe a weighty question, but
it is. It's like chapter 1. I am born. I took a circuitous route. I had always wanted to be a writer, but I had this bad habit of getting an idea, starting a book, writing about 2 chapters, and never going much past that. I would just lose steam or focus. When my dad passed away, I switched careers. I'd been working as a copywriter, and I went into makeup and special effects. And I actually think that change helped to spur getting this book done, because instead of, I used to write movie trailers, like In the End Without Justice. Except I was the only female writer on staff, so I usually got the jobs that were like, if it was a girl who couldn't catch a break. But I was doing that all day, so I'd come home and I'd be like, oh, I don't want to write, I just want to watch Law and Order and go to sleep. And, which I still do. When I started doing makeup and effects, I would be on set all day on my feet, and I would come home exhausted, after 12 hours of work, but ready to write. It was like all the ideas were just percolating all day. And so I promised myself I would write, I would finish. It didn't have to be good, it just had to be done. Finish a book, finish it, finish it, finish it. And I did, and it was terrible. The first draft was just crap, but that's what you have to do. And then I just got lucky, basically. Like, I revised, and then I queried the right people at the right time and landed with a wonderful editor and a wonderful agent, and yeah.
That's a good story.
Thank you.
Yeah, I've wanted to be a writer for as long, well, at least since I became a teenager. But I've never really thought about writing a novel before. I was very into poetry. I started out with my journals and went on to take creative writing classes in college and to get my MFA in poetry at the Writers' Workshop in Iowa City. And I loved it. But upon graduating, I thought, I'm going to have to figure out how to make a living now. Interesting. I guess poetry is probably not going to do the trick in that regard. So I moved out to LA. I'd also always loved film. I moved to LA with the idea that I wanted to try screenwriting. I got a job working for Stephen Chbosky, the author of The Perks of Being a Wallflower, just before we were going into production on that movie. And when I finally got the courage to show him some of my writing, he said, I really think you should try writing a book. And I thought of the title for this that same night, and it turned out that the story spoke to a lot of things that I was going through personally, and I really connected to it. much like Lee, the first draft did not read like anything that anyone would probably imagine would ever turn into a published book. But it was the first time that I knew that I was just going to keep rewriting it until it could be something. It was the first thing that I felt like I can stay with this forever. It doesn't matter how long it takes. This one like matters to me. So.
Well, when Alice sold, I sent flowers to my agent, and I put a card in the flowers that said, "You made my childhood dream come true," because this has really been a childhood dream of mine to publish a book. And I've always made my living with words. I'm an English teacher. I worked as a journalist before I became an English teacher. But I always wanted to write a novel. And actually, from the time I got my first agent to this, it took 7 years to get here. So that's the power of persistence, if anyone out there is a writer. I was writing contemporary when vampires were coming out. Nobody was really buying contemporary. I wrote 2 novels that got really, really close, and No Cigar. But I love writing, you know, and I just said, I'm gonna keep doing this because I still enjoy coming home, even after a long day of teaching and time with my family. I still really love words and making words make sense to some kind of story. So The Truth About Alice finally sold, and when I got my author copies, I did cry. I was just like, oh my God, you know. So it's been a long journey, but totally, totally satisfying.
Oh, that's a great question to have be our second question, because I know you guys, but I feel like I know you even better now. From your wonderful stories of how you got to be sitting here with me at this long white table. So I'm one of those women who had a career that was, I had one career, then I had kids, and I started a new one, because having the kids sort of took all the momentum away from my first career, which was I was an actor. And I was a comic actor, and I loved it. But I had a great time. And then I had kids, and suddenly I could no longer go into those auditions because I knew how judgmental they were. This is probably too honest for the second question in, but I was going to go for it. You know, I knew they were judging my weight and my body, having just had a kid, and I didn't want them to, because my body had just created this most beautiful baby, in my opinion, ever. I've since seen prettier babies. So she was the prettiest. And, you know, I couldn't do it anymore. I didn't care. I lived in LA, and I did not care if I ever fit into my skinny jeans again, you know? And so I couldn't be an actor. Or so I told myself. So but I'd always wanted to be a writer, always. And in fact, what I did as an actor was I improvised, which is just writing on your feet. So I went to school in UCLA, and I got a degree in screenwriting while my first daughter was an infant and a toddler. And then when I got pregnant with my second kid, I was at UCLA finishing up. And then I was just about to make my debut as a screenwriter when my husband got a job offer in New York. So we moved to New York, and then I was like, well, I'm really not going to try to be a screenwriter in New York City, because you have to live in LA, unfortunately. So I said, well, I'll do what I've always wanted to do. I'll try to write a book. So I had a friend who was a literary agent. I took her out to lunch. I pitched her 5 ideas. One of them was about 14 kids who get trapped in a superstore while civilization collapses. It was called We Are Value Mart. She said, I love the concept, I hate the title.
I still love that title.
I love it. We are Value
You can
Mart.
turn a t-shirt.
It's very good.
That's the comedy version.
Yeah. That's true. And in that version, they were actually going to live there for like 5 years. And it was like they were the tribe that lived in Value Mart. The series is very different from that.
I want to write that alternate universe.
So I wrote the first 150 pages. I wrote a proposal for what would happen in the rest of book 1 and book 2 and 3. My agent sent it to 10 publishers. 9 of them said no. 1 of them said yes. And you just need 1 yes, you know. And so that's how I got to be sitting here at this nice long white table.
Well, fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing. I actually have a question for each individual one of you, so not a general group. So, Emmy, if I could start with you.
Sure.
So you mentioned having kids, and Monument 14 revolves around this group of 14 kids. How does having kids, or how does having kids influence your writing of the book or those characters? How did that affect you writing about kids in such a horrible time?
Oh God, in many, many ways. It certainly helped with the character creation. So I've written this book over this series over the last 4 years, in which time my kids went from being 3 and 6 to 7 and 10. Don't check me on the math, I'm sure. The kids in here range in age, as I said, from 5 to 18. So I had like a 5-year-old when I was writing a 5-year-old, and 6 and 7 and 8. And so I used them all the time, their language, how they talk, how they see the world, the kinds of words they get wrong, nemelade instead of lemonade, on cute things like that. And I also could base some of the characters on kids that I knew, like Chloe in the book, who's incredibly irritating. It's based on someone I know. I won't tell you who. Someone's kid I know. She's a real piece of work, and that's what Chloe's based on. And nobody will ever know besides me who that lucky little boy or girl is. And then it made it very, the task I set myself in this book was actually something I learned doing improv with Amy Poehler and Matt Besser and Matt Walsh and Ian Roberts. Those other people you may not know, but Amy Poehler.
Ian Roberts, wasn't he in, what's it called? Bring It On.
Oh yeah. He was the
Spirit
Spartan.
And
Matt Walsh is on Veep right now.
Yeah.
Nice. But so they, in the improv that we did together, they were all about realism. What would really happen if a unicorn walked into the room? What would you really do? And so I kept asking myself that in this book. What would you really do? And that meant with the kid characters that, I could give them very realistic things, but also as a writer and as a mom, when I had them in trouble and in danger, and in book 2, they try to make it, a group of them tries to make it to Denver to be evacuated. And one of them, who was my favorite of the children, Max, is really severely injured. And I had this tension every day when I got to my office. It was like, I just had to write, I had like 100 pages to go, and I had to get this kid to safety. I felt so painful for him, and I wanted to get him safe. So, my experience as a mom really informed a lot of this book.
Thanks. So Jennifer, without spoiling anything for those of you who haven't read The Truth About Alice, I'll just say that it ends on a very kind of open-ended note. And I was wondering, was the ending different when you initially wrote it? Did you plan to kind of conclude it more? Did you like leaving it kind of wide open in terms of what happens to the characters after?
That is hard to answer without giving away the truth. But I've had the ending in mind, the scene with the 2 characters at the end. Before I even started writing, I had, I'm the kind of writer who does write with the end in mind. I have the final scene sort of in my head, and it shifted a little bit in revisions, and I got some advice that I took, and then I was like, no, I don't like, and it kind of took it in a very definite direction, and I wanted it to be a little more open-ended, so I kind of fought for the ending. But I will say, and maybe this is a bit of a spoiler, I did want a hopeful ending, because I think the book it's a tough read at times, and it's a heartbreaking read at points, but I wanted some hope in it too. So I hope that however the reader interprets what's going to happen next, that they at least have a hopeful feeling while reading it.
Thank you. And yeah, sorry for posing a question that was so fraught with potential.
No, I hope it intrigues people who don't want to read it. So no, that's a great question.
Ava, so for those of you who don't know, Love Letters to the Dead is written entirely in letter format, and I was wondering why you chose to structure your book that way, a book entirely told through letters.
I think it makes sense for Laurel, the character, because as she says at one point in the book, there's some things I can't say except to the people who aren't here anymore. She's somebody who's holding on to so much inside of herself, to so many secrets, that even as she's growing in her life and even as she's making connections with people in her new world, there's still a lot that she can't say. And I think that letters felt particularly appropriate to me because as opposed to something like a journal format, because there's something about a letter that signals a kind of hopefulness, a hope that somebody will hear you, that you're reaching into the world and wanting something to come back. So even though there's so much that's kind of stuck inside of her, at the same time she's, I think, reaching out into the world for an answer. And then of course the people who she writes to play very important parts in the story, and kind of as she learns about them and her own character development. So I think the letters allowed for that too.
Great. And then Lee. So Lee letting
Lee.
Okay.
It's like Bruce.
Trying to avoid butchering names here. So your books are set in a very, fantastical, amazing environment. And I was kind of wondering where that inspiration for Ravka for the Grisha came from. Whether it was just like a bolt of lightning or.
Ravka's a lot of different moments of inspiration. When I wrote the first draft, I always say, and this wasn't something I was thinking about when I wrote that first draft, but I always say that world building for me really breaks into two groups. There's the way power operates in the world, and there's the way the world just functions. So there's sort of sense of power, sense of order, and sense of place. And when I wrote the first draft, it was really only sense of order. How the magic functioned in the world, what the Darkling's powers were, what Alina's powers were, what it meant for, there was a general kind of monarchy and this army of conscripted, at the time they weren't serfs, but peasants. And so that was what was in place, but there was really no sense of the world around these people. And then I started the second draft, and I took a few months to research, and I went to a used bookstore, and I was looking through there, and I came across this Russian Imperial Atlas, and unless you think it was some beautiful leather-bound book, that I blew the dust off the cover, it was like a textbook from the 80s that was in this used bookstore. But there was a picture on the cover of three men in front of a sledge with fur hats on, in front of a palace of onion domes. I started flipping through, and there were import and export routes and military campaigns, and I instantly knew I'd already been writing in this world without realizing it. The division in wealth between the rich and the poor, the conscripted army, the failure to industrialize, this was all already in there, and it heightened those things. And then a lot of things changed, because of that research. Like Alina and Mal had parents in the first draft, because I was like, but because there's so many orphans with powers in fantasy, and I was like, I want to do something different. But then I did this research into the Napoleonic Wars, and I found out about these men who returned from the front and turned their dashas into homes for war widows and orphanages and schools for their serfs, and I couldn't get the idea out of my head. So the inspiration from the world comes from all kinds of places.
Thanks. So now a question, open it up back to all four of you. So I was wondering which character in your books is your favorite character, or the most fun character to write?
Well, I think I gave it away already. It's little tow-headed Max with a preposterous cowlick that will not be tamed. And Max is 8 years old, and he's had a very seedy life. His parents are always fighting. One of them's always dragging him to a strip club. He's seen guns handled. But he presents these stories just with this super chatty, matter of fact, oh, one time, oh yeah, at Emeralds they have these drinks of Jell-O, and they're horrible, and you think they'll be good because their colors are bright, but you taste them and they're terrible, and they make you throw up. So he's just a good-natured kid from the very
fast food one. The fast food one.
Yeah. Yeah, he tells a story about how his dad got one of his girlfriends when they went through a drive-thru. She was just so into him that he just pulled her through the window into his car.
Mine is Sturmont, is the character I was mentioning in Siege and Storm. He just, most characters take a while to settle into their voice, but he just showed up and wouldn't shut up. He just sort of waltzed onto the page and was like, guess what? I'm gonna play a major role in this story. So, and he's infinitely confident, he has so much swagger, and he can do so many things. He's an inventor, he's a privateer. He's just a pleasure to write. Most of my characters have so much doubt in them, and they're trying to do the right thing. And Stormhound's like, the right thing is making money, and that's what I'm gonna do. So I really enjoy writing him a lot.
He loves it when you quote him.
I'm really thrilled to hear you say that because he was my favorite character too. So much so that since I finished reading the series, I've been bothered by the fact that he isn't real because he was so great.
He's not hiding in my closet, I'm sorry.
Are you sure?
Alas.
We live in the same city. I'll go over and check our format guys if he's there. Please send help. Or I'll just kidnap him and take him home and never tell anyone.
Sorry, okay. I'll go. I would say, well, mine's told multiple points of view, but Kurt, well, all my characters for this book came so easily to me. When I was writing, it was like they were sitting next to me and just talking to me, and I was just writing down what they had to say. They were real people. They still are in my head. I think about where are they now, what are they doing. But Kurt, who is the one bright light in the darkness for Alice, really came the most easily. And I have to say, when my dad read this, he said, I saw a lot of myself in Kurt. And my dad and I are really close. We have a really close relationship. My dad's an engineer, kind of bookish and sort of, like Kurt likes to think about, he reads in the shower and he thinks about black holes folding in on themselves and stuff. Like that's stuff that my dad would do. He's just that engineering kind of mind. And so when my dad said, Kurt kind of reminded me of me, I was like, oh, but I got Kurt right, because that's kind of how the voice.
I would say it's a tie between, for me, Laurel's Aunt Amy. Her mom is taken off to California in the book, leaving her to split her weeks between her dad and her Aunt Amy, who has her own sort of problems, but is ultimately very loving, and she's very quirky. She has an obsession with the TV show Mr. Ed the Talking Horse, and with Cool Runnings, the Jamaican bobsled. She was kind of inspired by one of my own aunts, so that was fun. And then one of Laurel's best friends, Hannah, was my other favorite, who she's a sort of a wild and free on the outside, but is kind of holding on to her own secrets too, and I love the way that her and Laurel's stories intersected.
Great. And then Lee and Emmy, I have a question for both of you to answer. You both put your characters through such horrible things. Was that difficult as you got to know them, or was it just like, oh, sure, let's throw another disaster at you. This is what needs to happen.
It was hard. It was really hard. One of the fun things for me was that in Monument 14, the first book, it's just from the narrator is a guy named Dean, and it's just one point of view. And in Sky on Fire, the second book, it's narrated by Dean and his brother Alex, because as I mentioned, one group of kids leaves the store and tries to make it to safety while one group stays behind. And in Savage Drift, the third book, there's two narrators as well. There's Dean again, and then there's a girl named Josie. And Josie is the sort of mother hen of the group, and she's left behind by accident. Spoilery! Oh my God, terrible spoiler. But I don't know what to do. Sorry. And I said that. This is the second one for you today. Cancel. But I have to say, because the book is narrated by Dean and Josie. Wait, what was the question again? It's just one terrible thing after another. My brother described it originally as being handcuffed and thrown down a flight of stairs. Boom, 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 boom. But in a good way. But in Savage Drift, it was so fun to write Josie because Josie was really angry. She was angry about all the things that had happened to her and the things she did to protect those she loved. And so it was sort of like her, it was really interesting when I started to write her. I definitely had that feeling of her pulling up a chair. Although actually the feeling was like she was standing over me, like telling me what to write. And it was exciting because it was sort of like I had tortured this girl, and then she was like, all right, now you like take dictation, Laybourne. You owe me. You owe me to tell my story the way it really happened. And so, so I never felt bad about putting my characters through torture. I never did, but I feel like part of what's hard about writing the third book in a trilogy is giving them the endings that they've earned, that they deserve, that will feel satisfying to the audience, with the, striking the right balance. I'll just tell you how the book ends. So I feel that for all they suffer, I think they wind up in a place that was fair. So that's my answer.
Okay, I guess I would say two things. Yeah, I put them through a lot, but it was really important to me to not write an unrelentingly bleak series, and also not an unrelentingly bleak third book. Like, I didn't want the reader to feel beaten about the head and shoulders when they were done with it. And so this is like one of the only scenes I can talk about this not spoiled, but there's a scene where a group of women girls, try on, young adults, where they try on dresses and they talk about the fact that they're in the middle of the war, but they miss beautiful things, that they miss good food, and I wanted these moments of for there to be, there's always some humor in my books because I feel like that's the way I cope with dark situations, and I want my characters to have that available to them too. That said, who's a Game of Thrones fan? Okay, so I find it funny that most people focus on the way that Martin kills characters off. What interests me is that he does much worse things than kill characters off. What he does is, and what the best lesson I learned from him as an author was, you take away the thing that the character believes makes them who they are, and then you see what happens. And so I don't feel great about the things I do to them, but I also need to see what happens. So, that to me is where a lot of the conflict comes from. And it's never arbitrary. It's never like, oh, this would be a great place for someone to bite it, It's just, I want to take away the thing that you think makes you you and see how you come out of it on the other side.
God, that's so wise.
Yeah.
I am a very wise person.
I see that now. Only now.
At the end of this table, with this perspective.
We've gone, this is our third book tour together, but just now.
Just very subtle. Very stealthy wisdom. Yeah.
Well, it's definitely evident in your books. It's a great lesson. I'm kind of sad that that's the one that you learned just because it's so hard to go through with those characters. But
sorry, not sorry.
No, I wouldn't change a thing. Just
that's actually very flattering.
Had to push through the tears
If
first.
you read all of the Game of Thrones books too, there are so many characters in it in general that you have to do that over and over again while you're reading. So it almost feels easier to read this because there are fewer.
And they're done.
Yeah.
I just, in case I hadn't mentioned.
I'm not waiting the next 10 years for the next book to come out.
So Jennifer and Ava, so both of your books, I believe, are standalones, correct?
Yeah.
All right. Was there any temptation to write a sequel, or did you know that these character stories were going to be complete with these books?
That's a great question. I knew that the characters' stories would be complete here, but it was hard to say goodbye to them when the book was finished. I almost missed them, and now that I'm working on the screenplay now, it's just been optioned for film, and so that's allowed me to sort of revisit them in this totally different way, and it's almost like writing the book over again, because it can't be the same, but you have to capture the same spirit, and that's really
That's a fan question.
But would you ever consider writing a companion novel, for some of the later characters?
There's room, I think. I would consider that with a little bit of distance, I think.
I'm going to tweet that right now. I'm super excited about that. And if I tweet it, it'll make it true.
I am not opposed to revisiting these characters one day. I intended it to be a standalone, and I do love the ending so much personally. I mean, I know I wrote it, so I kind of have to say I love the ending, but I love it. I love the way it ends, but I also, I mean, like I said, these characters were like, I'm shopping in the grocery store and I see like, that's, you know, Elaine, or like that, you know, like you see people that remind you of who you think these characters are in your mind. So I just love them so much that I can't say I wouldn't ever visit them again, but then I'm also tempted to just leave it be because I really liked the way it ended too. So it's kind of a hard call.
I feel like Alice could be her own heroine in like a totally different book in like 10 years.
Yeah,
you know?
like some kind of companion
Alice
piece.
graduating from college
Right.
could be like
Nice.
Right now.
Just saying.
I know we're both like, but you could write more. But don't wait 10 years to write.
Okay.
Just 10 years.
Don't wait that. Or like 3.
Yeah.
We're graduating from high school.
Okay.
So I'd love to throw another round of individual questions at you. Emmy, there have been a lot of dystopian books that have come out lately, and that's kind of been the trend that, you know, we've seen
Sure.
in society, I don't know, has seen lately. Was there ever any temptation to handle the dystopian aspect, or did you know that you wanted to kind of put your characters right in the middle of the apocalypse?
I guess I don't understand exactly what you mean, handle the dystopian.
So, or, you know, rather than focus on kind of what happens after the disasters happen, after society has kind of fallen apart, rather than putting your kids right in the middle of it. Or I guess I kind of envisioned the world after Monument 14 kind of being a, you know, dystopia-esque in that so many terrible environmental things happen that it would be a difficult world to rebuild.
Yeah, you know, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I would be interested to read, one of you will have to write it. It's set like 50 years after this series of catastrophes. But what I wanted to do was write, what I wanted to do was write about teen boy power dynamics during the apocalypse. So it's not even a post-apocalyptic book, really. The second two and third, second and, oh my God. Books 2 and 3 are post-apocalyptic. Book 1 is apocalyptic. This is the apocalypse. Here it comes, you know, and it happens during the book. I think that the trend, there is a trend for the dystopian and post-apocalyptic books, and I heard a great Shonda Wilson maybe wrote. That's not her name at all. Shonda something. She wrote that teenagers are into this post-apocalyptic and dystopian trend because when you come of age, you need to destroy the world of your parents to create your own world. I'm just talking about your culture, your life, the things just around you. So when they read a post-apocalyptic book, it's like, yeah, like what if the whole construct of my parents' life was destroyed and I had to choose the society I was going to build? So that's what's happening in this book for sure. They are cut off. They cannot reach any adults. And they have to decide what kind of world they're going to build within this store. And then in books 2 and 3, it's like, all right, well, now what happens when what you've created is out in the world, where it's even more dangerous than the place you just were. So that was what I wanted to do. I'm not that interested in a classic dystopian, in writing a classic dystopian, where we're seeing a corrupt government in some either variation of the United States or some other world. I'm not that interested in government on a large scale and how it oppresses us, as I am in the choices that we make towards the light or towards the dark.
Thanks. Post-apocalypse is definitely the word that I meant / was looking for. So
Sure.
You answered my question even though I phrased it horribly. So kind of similar to Emmy's question, Jennifer, you mentioned that when you were writing your book there was kind of big like vampire trend, but you stuck with contemporary. Was there ever any temptation to switch genres in the hopes that perhaps that would help get you published, or did you know that a contemporary novel was the novel that you wanted to write?
My first agent, who left agenting, that is still a really great resource, he once said to me, don't chase trends. You write what you want to write. And as an English teacher, I'm really aware of all the trends, and I love learning about them all, and I love especially recommending books to, like, oh, you're into fantasy, you've got to check this out when you're in. But I've always just been a person who finds the real world fascinating. Like, I love spying on people. You think I'm playing on my phone, but I'm really listening to your conversation. You know, I mean, you don't know how handy that comes in to be a good spy as a writer.
Noted.
Really noted.
Our next book is about 4 authors on tour.
It all goes horribly wrong. You know, like I love documentaries. Like I find real people fascinating. So I think that just is something that I always wanted to write. So no, and if there are any writers in the room, I would say I think that's a great piece of advice. Write the book you want to write. The market will come around when it comes around. Don't chase trends just to get published. I would say. I don't think that. Yeah, it's good advice.
Thanks. Ava, the characters that are not the characters, the people that Laurel writes to play such a big role in the book. How did you go about choosing who she was going to write to, or was there anyone who didn't make it into the book?
Yeah, that's a great question. The list was evolving as I was writing the book. I started with a few people who I really loved and who had had a big influence in my life as I was growing up. But as I was getting to know Laurel's character and some of the particular things she was dealing with, you know, some of the people revealed themselves at that point. Some of the quirkier choices, like she writes to Alan Lane, who voices Mr. Ed. That came about when I figured out who Laurel's Aunt Amy was, and that she loved this person, and that Laurel was trying to find some way of connecting with her, or like some way of imagining a good life for this aunt of hers. And yes, there were several people who she wrote to who originally that didn't make it into the final deck. There were a bunch of letters to Emily Dickinson that I really loved. Maybe someday I'll find something, because I loved them.
Companion. I wish they got cut. Fans would love to read that. This one over here.
Those were probably, there are a few others, but those were probably the toughest to cut.
Walking away from this expecting a lot of new companion books from her. And then, Lee, you built an entire world in the Grisha trilogy. Did you ever feel overwhelmed by the world building aspect of it, or did you know that you wanted to create your own world for your characters?
Well, I didn't, I always felt like quite a hack because I didn't build the world first. I sort of had this idea that everybody was like Tolkien and built entire languages and everything. And then I went to a George R. R. Martin signing, and he talked about how the Dothraki that you read is all that exists, and that they had to build the language for the television show. And people would call him and be like, "Where can I find a Dothraki dictionary?" Don't ask me. Let me know if you find one. So I mean, the reason I started drawing a map was because I was losing track of where they were and the names of things. And there are times when, at this stage, now that there are 3 books, and particularly in writing my new book, which is set in the same universe but is not the same characters, where I was like, oh my word, there are so many towns. But beyond that, I never felt overwhelmed by it so much as there are times when I wish I hadn't created rules that I did. No, really, I deliberately created a constrained magical system. One of the driving forces of this book and that in writing it was what happens when you bring a gun to a magic fight. And if you don't constrain the magical system, nothing happens when you bring a gun to a magical fight. The wizard is like, ha ha ha, I have a dragon, that's the end of the fight. So that was a big part of it, and so magic is, it's a finite resource in this world, and the way it operates is in some ways very scientific. And so in book 2, I wanted Sturmhond to have a flying sky fortress. And I was like, there is no way you would ever have this in this world. It is a terrible use of resources. It would be a complete waste of energy. It is a stupid, stupid choice. So I had no flying sky fortress. But someday. Yeah. But there is the temptation to you write yourself into a corner and you're like, I wish I could just be like, magic.
Were you ever tempted to use magic as a way out, or were you,
The temptation is there, but you can't, you make the rules to break them, but you have to break them in ways that have consequences. And, you don't get to cheat. And there's some rule of writing, I don't remember what it is, but a coincidence can never be helpful. You know, a coincidence can be terrible. Like, oh gosh, what were the chances that that spy would see me here? But it can't be like, oh, what were the chances that this wizard would be walking along this path and have this, have just the amulet.
That's more wisdom.
That's
full of
more
wisdom. Writing wisdom. That's gold.
I waited this long.
And then, Emmy, we have a question. So both of your trilogies, not series, yeah. Did you know from the start that you were going to write a trilogy? Did you ever feel challenged to keep yourself in that trilogy frame, or did it all just flow?
I was hired to write 2 books, actually. Macmillan hired me to write Monument 14 and the second book in this duo, and then duet. And then it was doing so well that they asked me to write a third when I was about 3/4 of the way done with Sky on Fire, which I'm actually so happy about, because I think frequently in a trilogy, and this happens in neither mine nor in Lee's, you have like the beginning, which is awesome, and it's so exciting, and then the middle book where they tread water. They tread water for 300 pages, and then the end. And you know, that does not happen in Sky on Fire, because it was a 2-book thing. So it was like, it's headed right towards the end, and then a certain person is the certain left behind, which I might have mentioned. And then I thought to myself, all right, I didn't mention it. God bless you, sir. Good on memory. And then, so I had this wonderful, so when they asked me, I was like, oh, yes, 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 let me tell this story. So the third book, I think, unlike the third book in some trilogies, really has a beginning, middle, and an end. It's telling a story. That's all.
When I first was writing Shadow and Bone, my only goal was to finish a book. And the idea that I would be able to finish 3 books was completely out of my thoughts. But halfway through Shadow and Bone, I was like, oh, the ending I have been thinking of is the wrong ending. Like, there is a much bigger arc here, and wouldn't it be great if it could be this and this? And I started keeping notes for the second and third books in the hope that maybe somebody would want them, and luckily somebody did. But I will say the weird thing was that, like, at the end of book 2, I had this moment where I was like, this could be an 8-book series instead. I was like, because all the action of these 3 books takes place over a year, which is really uncommon in epic fantasy. Epic fantasy is usually like epic. So, and I had this moment where I was like, this could actually span many, many years. And then I was like, I don't want to write those books. So I stuck with the original plan, and I'm glad I did. Yeah.
Well, there's, oh yeah.
Do you ever think that you can do too much to a series? Like, do you think there are series that could have ended sooner, but the author decided to write more books instead?
I mean, I see a lot of people nodding. I think it depends on the series, and it depends on the author. Like, and it's true for television shows, right? Too.
Yeah.
Like, there's always like, do they? You know, it's the whole jumping the shark thing. So, I mean, yes, I think there are certain things. There were certain series I read and where I simply got fatigued. You know, where I glommed like the first 12 or whatever, and then I was like, I'm detecting a theme. But I think that just depends on the amount of stories. What Emmy was talking about, and one of the things that drives me nuts though is that the convention that I can't stand in a series is like, there's something you need to know, but I can't tell you. You know, like, I honestly, like, if there's a guarantee that I will throw a book across the room, like, you know, you better have built in a real, like, as in, like, your lips will fall off if you tell that, like, because that to me feels like I had one kernel of story and I needed to draw it out. But I think you have to judge on a case by case.
Do you think similar things too?
I do. I thought that question was for Lee. You know what I was thinking? I was thinking while that whole conversation was happening, I was thinking about the selection. How many people here have read the selection? The Kira Cass? Oh, not that many. Not as many as I thought. That one suffers from middle bookitis. It's insane. The middle book, nothing happens. Holy crap! Is she here? Is she in this room?
Now I love
Don't tweet that, you guys. On memory.
The man in black, like, one.
Let me point out that Emmy's been on 3 tours, and she chose this tour to get real. Like this is her. That's real.
Anyway, I'm sorry. Have you read the last book? I have read the last one.
Because I love the middle book.
Oh, you like the what?
I like the second book.
You like the second book?
And I DNF.
You DNF? What is that?
Did not finish.
Did not finish. Whoa! I've never heard that term before.
Have you not spent any time on Goodreads?
There's a GIF, I'm sure, for DNF. I think we got
That is so cruel.
Are you having a moment where you're like, why did I lose?
I'm not even going to do this.
Yeah, we're gonna be to the chat after. No, I love being so careful to like avoid naming any particular. Like, I think it's on a Kate, and he was just like, okay, here's an example.
I really was. I wasn't looking for anything. Oh my God, Kara Cass is gonna assassinate me.
We'll protect you, Emmy.
I love this book. I love the premise.
For her agent.
I promise that stays within this room, except for when we have a video. No, I'm kidding. So we've talked a lot about companion books. Just getting me more excited about all of them, by the way. But I was wondering if you could maybe talk about what you have in the works upcoming, maybe a new series, something you're excited about, what you want to share, or what you can share without your lips falling off.
Something you need to know, but I can't tell you.
I could share the book I just turned into my editor that we're hoping to wrap up this summer. Tentatively titled Devoted. I'm thinking it's going to stay titled Devoted. I guess it's not a companion novel, but it is set in the same sort of semi-rural Texas world that I have in my mind, these towns that I've created, these names. And it's about a 17-year-old girl named Rachel Walker, and she lives with her family, a very large family, and she's part of a very conservative, isolated religious community. Some might call it a cult. She's never cut her hair, she's never worn pants, she's never been to school, she's expected to marry young, have a lot of children, and there's a trigger that causes her to start exploring the secular world, and she has to make some really hard decisions about what does she want to believe in, what does she want to devote her life to. So that's my second book.
Cool. I'm working on, well, I just turned in the first draft of my new book, which is called The Dregs. And it is a fantasy novel set in if you look at the map in here, you'll see a little country called Kerch, which is, it's kind of the opposite of Ravka. Ravka's been sort of economically hogtied for years, and Kerch, meanwhile, is the center of all trade, legal and illegal, in the world. It's kind of my Ocean's 11, Inglourious Basterds, Dirty Dozen, ragtag band of misfits, impossible heist story. So yeah, very excited about it.
Same.
I think I mentioned I'm working on the script for this right now. It's just got optioned by the producers of Fault in Our Stars and Fox 2000. So
Sorry, what is
the
Fault in Our Stars?
Let me tell you about the Fault in Our Stars.
Oh no, Emmy!
Here, that's how they advertised it.
Well, I loved the book and the movie, so I'm really excited to be working with that too.
Oh, yeah, it's so exciting. I just turned in my next book. It's called Sweet, and it is about it's about a celebrity-studded luxury cruise to launch a new diet sweetener, and the diet sweetener makes you lose weight. And it's great, and people love it, and they pile all these sort of half celebrities, like reality shows, and Paris Hilton types, onto this cruise to show the world how fantastic the sweetener is, and it's great. It works. They're losing weight. They feel great. They feel kind of lusty and wonderful. But then the only thing is, like, they want more. They want more of it because it makes them feel so good, and they want more and more, and then they eventually riot. The passengers, these skinny passengers, riot, and they tear apart the galley, and they find this big sack of this stuff, and they take it, and now they're like bone stick skinny, and they're raving, and there's none left. And they're on a cruise ship in the middle of the ocean, and there's none of it left because they licked it out of the carpet and anywhere they can find it, and they can only, but they still smell it. They can still smell it. Each other's blood. So they can skinny zombie. Skinny, famous zombie.
Yeah. And so
we are value marks.
Oh my God.
So that's what it is. Wow. I'm sorry I scared you, Jennifer.
No, I'm excited. I wasn't looking scared in a good way.
Thank you.
So last thing I'd like to ask before we open up to questions proper. I'm sorry for monopolizing so much of your time. You're just all so great. Anyway, one question that we ask some of our authors who come is, what is the one book that made you fall in love with reading? So I was wondering if there's one book from your childhood that just kind of really
Little House in the Big Woods.
As an independent reader, The Outsiders for sure in 6th grade, which I read in one night, and I failed a science test the next day because I didn't study, and I never failed tests. But The Outsiders. But I have to say, even prior to that, my mother read me Charlotte's Web when I was about 7 or 8, and I lost it. I was hysterically crying in bed, and my mother didn't know what to do with me. She just kept staring at me, and I was just sobbing. So I think Charlotte's Web really is what did it.
You were like, I want more.
Yeah, I want to sob again. Yeah, it's great.
What did I say last time? I would say, well, I loved both the Little House series and Charlotte's Web. But as a teenager, the first book I remember reading in middle school is The Giver. That completely shook my world. Yeah.
It's hard for me to say what made me love reading, because I just remember loving reading, but I can say that the book that made me love genre was Dune. It was the first book I finished, and I was like hurtling towards the end of it, and so sorry that it was over. I mean, I know there's like 32 more books, but but at the time I was like, I need to go, where I just wanted to start all over again, and it was one of my senior yearbook quote was from Dune. It was one enemy at a time.
That is a perfect angst-ridden teenage senior yearbook quote.
Dune for me was like, it was a survival handbook. Like, it wasn't, I loved Catcher in the Rye, but it was like, man, life is awful. It's awful, and let's mope. Whereas Dune was like, learn to fight, learn to be political, be prepared, and that's what I needed. That's what I needed to be reading.
See, I was reading Catcher in the Rye. I was just depressed. That's another favorite.
Yeah. So questions from y'all? Yep.
This is for Jennifer. So in your book, there's a lot of characters that, well, I wouldn't say they're like completely, but most of them have like good qualities about them, but obviously a lot of them, are lying or, have questionable morals. Was that hard for you to write?
First of all, thank you for saying they have good things about them, because I think some folks have reacted to the characters and just, I hate them, they're awful. And they do really awful things, for sure. But I really wanted and hope that readers will see their humanity too. And one line that ran through my head as I was writing this was that, it's like one of those quotes you hear or see on Facebook or whatever that people talk about. It was like, everybody has a story inside of them that if you heard it, it would break your heart. And if we knew that, if we remembered that, put that in the forefront of our minds when we're interacting with each other, we would be a lot kinder to one another. So, it wasn't hard to write, because I think these characters are how people really are. We have all done awful things that we regret, but we all have that soft spot, that sad story in us that makes us hopefully human too, that we deserve empathy and sympathy.
That's like a perfect quote to show how you wrote those characters.
So it wasn't hard. It was hard to put my characters through some difficult things, but it wasn't hard to create what I hope are fully rounded characters. Thank you.
Yes, a writing question. You had said that you loved words, and I was just wondering, for these books, how much of it was a love affair and how much of it was not a hate affair, but how much of it was like a struggle?
A hate affair. Let's meet up in Vegas and throw rocks.
Was it an easy flow, or did you generally, I mean, they're all totally different books, but how much of it was really a struggle?
I think there are always, for most writers, I think there are always good days and bad days. You do it because I write, I think, because I'm much more unhappy when I don't write. Meaning I'm much happier when I write, but that doesn't mean that, I think we always have moments of, you have to fight with it sometimes. Like you have to put on the gloves and duke it out with the story until you find where you're going, and you have to be patient, so patient with that.
Yeah, I feel like the moments of struggle are different for every book, or have been for me thus far. And I mean, for me, writing dialogue is the most comfortable, pleasurable thing to do. Like, I sometimes write entire scenes in dialogue and then go back and change things to narration and to exposition, or I don't even know, blah blah blah. See, I like words, but I think there's also sort of these moments where you get into the zone and where you have a beautiful writing day where you actually feel. Where you feel like it's your calling and you feel like this is what you were meant to do, and then there are the days when you feel like it is a job and a job you're not very good at. And I honestly think those days, and whether you learn to embrace them and to recognize that feeling of failure as the truth in your calling, as in those are the signs you're trying to do something bigger and more difficult than anything you've done before. Yeah. Those days are the difference between an amateur and a professional, and an unfinished book and a finished book, and a dream and something that becomes a reality. I thought wanting to be a writer meant it was going to come easy, and it doesn't a lot of the time.
It's definitely a love affair for me. I love writing, and when I don't get to write, I get crabby. I really want to be in the story, and I find that I go away. I feel like I am communing with something bigger than me, and my ego goes away. When I write, I lose myself in the story, which is delicious. But what I've found since I became a professional novelist, since I got hype, since when they paid me money, has been this journey of how can I describe this? There were things that were really hard. One thing that was hard was writing a book a year. That was a deadline that was really hard for me. And I was really stressed about it, and the writing didn't come well, and what I had to do was actually look at my lifestyle and say, what are the things in my lifestyle that are getting in the way of me loving writing? Because I know I love writing. So what's getting in the way of that? And for me, since this is the night when I'm being totally honest, it was things like eating sugar. I don't eat sugar anymore. I don't eat it like an alcoholic doesn't drink, because it makes me crazy, and because I crave it all the time. And when I was eating it, I spent all day thinking about when I was going to have it.
Was this how you got the idea for Sweet?
Yeah. Sweet is about addiction. It's about addiction and how I felt. That is how I felt. I felt like I could bite someone's neck to drink sugar out of their veins. No, I didn't. That's too much. Even for me, that's too much. I cannot say that. So that fell away. I stopped eating sugar because it was getting in the way of my writing, and I stopped playing video games because I would go to my office. I rented a space, and I would go there on Sky on Fire, and I'd be like, okay, well, I'll just play video games for an hour on GameDuel.com, where you're like playing for money, and I would play like Jewel Blitz or something for an hour. And I'm like, okay, well now I got rid of my anxiety, I can write. Well, it was like a mess. I was wasting, I would lose hours. The more stressed I was, the more time I would play video games. And you know what? I had to ditch the video games because I wanted to be a writer. I wanted to be a professional writer. So I stopped playing video games. And my productivity, I wrote Sweet in like 6 months. whereas it had taken me 10 months with Sky on Fire. It's just because I'm playing video games and eating sugar. I know this is kind of a really weird answer. I didn't hear what you said.
I love the like the author bad habits versus like rock star bad habits.
Writer bad habits.
They are. But you know, when you love something, you want to make it, you want to get everything else out of the way. So if you guys love to write, or you love to do anything, think about what's getting in your way and take it out. Your cats know. You keep your cats. Oh, Kira cats? I didn't say anything mean. I thought she said something else. That was not mean. I love Kira Cass. I hope I get to meet her one day. Kiss her right on the mouth. And take my showers. Yes, Jen?
Well, I would say, you know, I'm not going to lie. There are times where I'm writing and it just comes so hard. But then there are days I'm writing alone. I write in my dining room. I have to have the lights off. And I'm writing, and I'll catch myself writing like this. You know, I'm like so thrilled by this becoming, oh yeah, you know, or I'm like this or whatever. And so I think when I have those reactions to what's actually happening, it's just such a pleasurable activity. I mean, it has to be pleasurable, or why would we do this? I mean, it's hard work, so there is a pleasurable element to it. But I agree with what all of them said. I mean, you have to make time for it. You have the days where you feel like, what the heck am I doing? And then I think those are the days where you hope that it means you're stretching yourself. So, you know, writers are a wacky bunch. I mean, we put ourselves through some really hard stuff, but ultimately, you know, that saying, I hate writing, but I love having written, you know, I think there's some truth to that. The process can be very difficult, but God, it feels good to get done and have a book you're proud of, you know? So, I would echo what they all said, except I still eat sugar.
Sorry, it's all right.
I'm sorry.
It's fine.
I can smell it on you.
Well, that took an interesting turn.
Welcome to Fierce Read.
Any more questions?
I think they're afraid of what might happen.
Well, great. Thank you all so much for being here and answering our questions.
Thank you guys
So
for
nice to
coming.
welcome you all. Just a couple, you know, side notes. We've got some Fierce Read tote bags, posters, and postcards in the back if you'd like. We also have a list to put your email on to hear about our upcoming events, young adult events, as well as a flyer for an upcoming event we have at the end of June and our young adult book group. So help yourself to free stuff. And for signing, we're going to start at one end of the table and then just cycle on down. So, Callie, go. Do you want to